Is December 6th, 2024, Taylor Swift Day in Vancouver, and we are joined today by Shezan Muhammedi, who is an acting assistant director with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and also an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. Shezan completed a PhD in history and migration and ethnic relations at the University of Western Ontario in 2017. And after you worked for a profit called Focus Humanitarian Assistance under the Aga Khan Development Network as a program officer on European Settlement Support Program. And you are the author of the book that we are going to be discussing today, Gifts from Amin, The Resettlement, Integration, and Identities of Ugandan Asian Refugees in Canada, which was published by the University of Manitoba Press in September 2022. Thanks for coming on today.
Oh, my pleasure. My absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And we are also joined, Diana is off today, by Myra Thakrar, who works as a partner with me at Larley Rosenberg. And Myra has an intense interest in this topic. Her father, Dr. Mansukh Thakrar, was one of the people who immigrated to Canada as a result of Idi Amin's policies to expel all, I mean, we'll get into this in a second, Asians or Indians, depending on the term that you use, from Uganda. And Myra, welcome back on. It's been a few years since you were on the podcast.
It has. Thank you for having me. It's a very exciting topic.
Yeah, Myra and I have a few history podcasts that we listen to. So we both share an interest in history, and Myra, obviously, in this topic in particular. Why don't we start before we get into the history and the topic of the book? I think some listeners might be interested that you're both a director or an assistant director with IRCC and also a professor at a university. How did you wind up in both of those roles?
Yeah, great question, Stephen, and thank you for asking it. I think the interesting part about my role with Carleton University is as an adjunct professor, so the full title is adjunct research professor. This is an honorary title, so often you are vouched for by other faculty to be offered a title. It lasts for about 5 years in length. So the advantage is it allows me the opportunity to access university resources like the library, apply for grants, and things like that to conduct research, and the ability to also supervise a student and teach one course. So it allows a little bit of flexibility. The downside is that I am not remunerated for any of those efforts. So you have the opportunity to teach a course, but it's sort of in your own time if you wish to do so. You, of course, have to go through the usual process of pitching a syllabus, getting it vetted by the faculty, and then proceeding with the course. And then, of course, hoping that students are interested in it. So this allows me that flexibility to work full time with the federal government at IRCC, as well as keep that academic connection. I think it was really important. The big reason I got involved with Carleton in this capacity was to host a conference in November of 2022, commemorating the 50th anniversary. So that allowed me to apply for federal grants and put that whole conference together. Of course, with tons of support from Carleton University and the library in particular. So the MacOdrum Library at Carleton University has this unique Uganda collection. And so our partnership started very early on when I was doing my original dissertation research, where I wanted to have the opportunity to share the oral histories. Of course, with consent from the participants, but often what happens with academic research, as you know, is a bunch of research and really incredible rich detail is done, but then it can't be released. It can't be shared with the public. And so Carleton was very open to the idea of I'd have to have dual ethics approval, so both from Western University and Carleton, and of course consent. But from there, almost 25 of the oral histories I did for my dissertation were also part of Carleton's collection, and these can be accessed for many years to come and future generations, which was amazing. And then in that process, they brought me in as an advisor to help build the archive and source some participants. So I've been involved with Carleton since 2012 on that venture, and so that's been really cool.
Is it
And
something then like a topic where more and more is still coming out, like new stories are being brought forward?
exactly. And they're continuing to collect more oral histories as well. So if anyone is listening to this podcast is interested, I'm still working with Carleton, so I'm still conducting more oral history interviews, and we're always looking for more folks to contribute stories and add more to the collection. We're even looking at building a short little podcast series over,
Oh, neat.
I'm thinking about 5 to 7 episodes, 30 minutes each, that will cover some of the latest themes from oral history participants. So we've done a new round of interviews. I've done 5 so far, and hoping to do another 5 to 10,
I have
and then
some
kind of
names
piece
for
together
you.
some things. Oh, amazing! Thank you.
I'm on the website now. I noticed it a few weeks ago, but I didn't realize you were so actively still pursuing this.
Absolutely,
That's
yeah, definitely.
amazing.
And we've captured more stories that I think reflect more and more of the diversity of the community, from very different religious backgrounds, and folks that have settled across the country. A lot of folks ended up in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, but recently I just done an interview with someone that ended up in Nova Scotia.
Oh.
So they've got a very interesting story.
And just before also we dive into it, I want to like for the term, I know like when I think of the topic, I generally think Indians expelled from Uganda. I noticed in your book you used the term Asian. You explain why in the book. But for this interview, like which is the term that is more generally, used, or are they kind of, do you hear them used interchangeably?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Stephen. Most people use Ugandan Asian to both kind of outline their various identities as being both Ugandans and from the Indian subcontinent. So a lot of this stems from that use of, prior to the independence in 1942 of India, a lot of folks were just considered to be, this catch-all term of Asians, and that was what was used even in the media, in Uganda as well. And that
Mhm.
was tied to this term Muindi, which is this like Swahili term for Indian. But after partition, instead of being able to save, someone's of Pakistani background, of Indian background, they just used this catch-all term Asian because it was easier,
Yeah.
and a quick way to identify folks. And so that was used in the media, even in government documents, and even on the Canadian side too. So they would call them like Asian expellees. They use that term often. Was expellees was the way to go up until they arrived in Canada. That was really interesting to see the narrative shift where they start calling them refugees. And it was purposeful because if you
Yeah.
called them a refugee from the beginning, it required certain regs and regulations to be followed in how we evaluate and admit these individuals to Canada from an immigration policy perspective. But by using the term expellee, you didn't have to be as relaxed in your selection criteria, um,
And
as you did
relaxed
In
if they
the
were
it was.
refugees.
I noticed that, like, I'm sure we're going to get into that. The selection, which is something that I've been very interested in for probably more than 15 years, the selection process, and probably most immigration lawyers spend way too much time thinking about it. I'm excited to talk about sort of the selection criteria and how that was applied to the expellees. So, and the term Asian, I grew up hearing that from cousins. I have cousins who are still in Kenya. Even in the UK, Asians is a term in Canada that's used differently, of course, but I've heard that always. And I had to ask the same question Steve just asked is, what do you mean by Asian? So that's a good explanation.
Well, and it like you mentioned in the book that some of the people after they uh immigrated or moved or fled to Canada in the local communities that they were in were called Packies by some of the local um I guess white Canadians, and they may not have been from there. It's a complete, was that like, I mean, we're really jumping around a bit now, but I would imagine that that's also, did their perception of themselves, like Myra said that she heard the term Asian, did most stick with that sort of way of identifying, or did it kind of switch to the way most are referred to here now is like you hear South Asian, East Indian, or is it's clung to like expellee as you were saying, Asian?
Yeah, it seems that the larger narrative and in the media and the discourse is still Ugandan Asian, still use that term. Folks themselves are getting more nuanced with their identities, and certainly probably were even at the get-go. So a lot of folks are now saying, I'm a Goan Canadian, and the ordering of the hyphenation is super interesting. Or they'll say like, I'm a Canadian, period. Like I have
Yeah.
nothing else to add to that, which is also very fascinating. Or people will get very descriptive. They'll be like, I'm a Canadian, Ismaili of Ugandan background but of South Asian ancestry. Um, so some folks really get into the nuance and talk about all the elements of their identity.
Or depending on the argument they're trying to win, which was something I heard growing up a lot. Well, as an African, well, as an Indian, like it just depended on whatever the discussion that was happening around the group of Indian men sitting in my living room. So yeah, it's been a flexible kind of use of that terminology, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those who are completely new to the topic and have no real concept of what we're talking about, in brief, in 1972, Idi Amin, the president dictator of Uganda, essentially gave all Asians in Uganda 90 days to leave. And the international community had to rush and respond. And Canada wound up taking in thousands of Ugandan Asian expellees. Before we get into the whole background, I want to focus on one part of the book because it's these little stories of history that I always find fascinating. And I'll kick myself if at the end of the episode we hit stop and I go, oh, I didn't ask. When it came to determining the number of Ugandans that Canada would accept, you describe how there was like two people kind of sitting, I think, at a restaurant while a hockey game was going on. And I couldn't quite figure out how the finger symbolism worked. Like somebody was saying you need to take more than 3,000. And was it Canada scored a sixth goal and a waiter was like signaling, hey, there's 6 goals. And the guy who was being lobbied put up 6. And then the person who was advocating said, oh, Canada's going to take 6,000. And that's how the
Exactly.
number was decided. Is that basically what happened?
So that's largely the story that's told. So the from a cabinet perspective, so from like the documents, that was the upper limit. So the upper limit was we're going to do 6,000 people or spend $5 million, whichever comes first. That was from the policy perspective, but of course that was a secret cabinet document. So whenever Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was pushed on how many numbers, you'll see the media like really probing how many people are you going to do, how many people you can do. He just says, we're prepared to take as many as that qualify. And so what ends up happening is the Aga Khan is in town for a meeting. This is late September, September 28th, to meet with folks. And this is game 7 of the summit series. This is between Canada and Russia at the time, like I guess USSR at the time. And of course, because of the status of the Aga Khan, he merits a formal dinner with executives, usually held at Rideau Hall. And everyone who could defer did. So from the government perspective, they're like, I really want to watch this game, so I'm going to pass it down. So it ends up being, which is quite rare. You have a director general hosting this dinner, James Cross. And so what ends up happening is, and of course, I have to caveat this, is that this is the alleged story. I have no actual confirmation of this. It has just become such a popular myth that I had to talk about in the book. There are many folks that allude to the fact that this may actually, in fact, be true. It's really been Michael Malloy. So he was second in command in Kampala as an immigration officer, vetting applications and making things happen. Roger St. Vincent was the lead on the ground. And so Michael Malloy talks about this story quite a bit. And I think he's heard it from pretty reputable sources. And that's what's led to this myth evolving. And essentially, it's exactly what you've said, Stephen, is the Aga Khan was kind of sitting at one side of the table, at the head of the table. And they put him, so the way Michael describes it is he's right by the door to the kitchen. And so the maitre d' who's coming in and out, serving plates and things like this, was told, you've got a TV back there, signal the score. And the person at the opposite end of the table, James Cross, would then put his fingers down and signal, who's who. Of course, the rights being like his right-hand side representing left-hand sign representing the communists, right-hand sign representing the Canadians, and just to give the score. And so what ends up happening is there's this huge moment where Canada ties up the game, makes it 6-6, and so he puts both his fingers down a little too aggressively to say 3-3, and it's apparently at that exact moment where the Aga Khan's saying, how many are you taking? Like, what's the number? And as he sees the 3-3, he goes, 6,000? Wonderful. And at that point, I don't think
Oh,
they were
that's
able to walk
amazing.
it back, but there's no like meeting minutes. Like, I mean, there's meeting minutes, but there's no like play by play. So sadly, I can't confirm it as fact from archival documents. Um, but a really
No, I would
entertaining
And in
imagine
the
that no one
end,
took notes being like, we were told not to go above 3, but I accidentally signaled in a hockey game and I couldn't back. That won't appear in the official note taking.
it got to, what was the final number? And I know we'll get into that, but what was the final number?
Yeah, so total number is
So
7,550 after the family reunification
yeah,
piece.
yeah, right.
So it was very close. Like they had issued 4,175 visas within those 90 days.
Yeah.
So they were heading towards the 6K mark.
Which you
Uh,
said was up till that time the largest non-white refugee resettlement to Canada.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially in after the Second World War, this was the big one.
Yeah. So how, like, if we just, go back in the beginning, how did, like, why were there Asians in Africa in the first place? Like, what's the history of, I keep wanting to say Indian, of Asian migration to Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania?
Yeah, and so a lot of it, there's a long history. So this is one of the things that's ignored sometimes is that Indian Ocean trade world was going on, since the like ninth century. So there was a lot of trade that was happening between, the southern tip of India and then largely into Zanzibar. And there was a
Yeah.
good set of trade that was happening and everything from like spices, a little bit of like gold, ivory, and then of course, sadly, slaves. So slave trade was rampant, especially up until like the 15th century. There's estimates that the king of Bengal was in possession of almost 5,000 African slaves.
Wow.
Um, so there were some established trading networks, and a lot of this is where we get that early notion of South Asians, in East Africa as traders and merchants.
So before
Also,
the British were there, like before
before
the British were arriving in India, and
correct.
then the Indians were going to Africa. So that's really interesting.
Exactly. So
Well, I think
this,
it fully predates, like the Indians,
Mhm.
like before the Mughals, they were going to, yeah, trading in Zanzibar, what's now Ethiopia.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So there was, and same with the Arab communities, like very strong um, trading networks that were already in existence. Folks were not traveling as far inland as you can imagine and really establishing routes,
Right.
but this was kind of the network that already exists. This scales up significantly starting the 1850s onwards. And a lot of this is driven by colonial expansion. So the British and their imperial conquest, part of what they were trying to do in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda was establish the same colonial structures. And what better way to do that than to bring the same South Asians that are working for them under British rule to have them establish the same system there. So that's why a lot of folks start to move is because there were favorable immigration policies. Um, One really good example is for the Goan community. A lot of them were civil servants with the Indian, within the Indian subcontinent, and then they were picked specifically by the British to also set up the same civil service structure in Uganda in particular. And so they were offered this 4-year annual leave. So you could work 4 years in Uganda and then you get a year paid holiday to go back to Goa.
Hmm.
And so folks were excited to take up this opportunity. Over time, a lot of Goans stopped taking that 1 year back in
They
Goa
forgot to leave, right? That's what.
and spent time, yeah, and
Yep,
spent time
yep.
in Uganda and really established some firm roots. So starting from the 1850s, you have this big wave of folks coming as merchants, as traders, as tailors. And then you also have that movement of indentured laborers. So these are a lot of folks that were recruited to build Kenya and Uganda's national railways. And this is where the big myth that Idi Amin puts forward is, there were 32,000 folks that came over to help construct the railway, but only about 6,000 decided to stay. Many went back, like the vast majority went back. And so Idi Amin keeps saying they came here to build the railway and then forgot to go home, to your point, Myra. Yeah, he says it all the time during this campaign. So those are kind of the main categories. Is a lot of folks were searching for a better life and better opportunities, and there were a lot of folks that were having success in small scale, really tiny little general stores, if you will. And these are referred to as the dukas, and then they were known as the dukawalas, so the shopkeepers.
Dukan, or in Gujarati,
Dukans.
dukan.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a few of those in my family.
Exactly. And a lot of them were setting up shop right along the railway because they knew that there were going to be railway stops and people were going to need access to, everything as basic as like snacks for your journey, but things a little bit more complicated as they're trying to like settle roots throughout East Africa.
So is it, do they need permission from the British to move at this point, or is it kind of just within the empire? People from India can go to another colony.
Exactly. So they made it easier that they were going to what was, the very early days of a Commonwealth, that you had that ability and that flexibility to move as British subjects. So that's what the term they use is you're a British subject going to another British protectorate at this point. So by the 1900s, when 1904, I think is the exact date when they established the British protectorate of Uganda, this makes it even easier because now it's formal legislation that British subjects can reside in Uganda.
And you talk about in the book that, I mean, you mentioned the Dakas, that at the time of independence, post Second World War, Asians in Uganda held a disproportionate amount of the wealth.
Exactly. So what had happened is over time, because of this, they were really placed in the middle of society, if you will. So there's this term that they use as the colonial sandwich, where you kind of have your white British imperialists at the top, you have your brown South Asians in the middle, and then you have your laboring Black Ugandans at the bottom. And so what ends up happening is if folks are trying to fight back against the system, as Black local Ugandans were trying to say, hey, we're not getting access to certain goods, we're not able to participate in the political system, the only way to actually get to the people in charge were through the South Asians, because you would have to go to the government and the government office would be headed by a Goan, and then they had a vested interest in not forwarding your request to the imperialists because that would knock down their middle tier position. So it was this really awkward situation for a lot of South Asians because they could understand that colonial occupation and rule was very difficult because that's what was going on in India, in the Indian subcontinent. But at the same token, they were like, we're in this privileged position where we're able to capitalize on these agreements and do well and raise our families quite well. So it was this nuance that gets lost sometimes, where there were a lot of South Asians that, of course, had house staff that were all Black. There were folks that also participated in a ton of philanthropy under the radar, not really well documented. And then things evolve, right? So like the Madvanis and the Metas set up massive foundations. They end up employing and educating a lot of local Ugandans. And they even had a managerial program. So the Madvanis and Metas both had managerial programs set up for Black Ugandans because they saw that with independence on the rise, with the establishment of this, eventually it's going to need to transfer power. We're going to need to have Black Ugandans who are able to take over the enterprise. And then, of course, policy follows suit. So when Obote comes to power, and then, of course, Idi Amin thereafter, they're all trying to spur economic innovation for Black Ugandans. And so they start putting in rules and regulations that require things like 50% of the shareholder of a company, 51%, needs to be a Black Ugandan, needs to be someone of, the indigenous population, if you will. And so the Madvanis and Metas were trying to do that.
Sorry, the timing then was in the 60s. We're talking the lead up. So what year did Idi Amin actually take power, and how did that come to be?
Well, let's do
Yeah.
Obote first.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bote
Skipping
comes
a
to
decade.
power.
Okay.
Yeah. No, of course. And so independence is 1962. And so he comes to power, and it's this really interesting setup where he's prime minister of like the president of Uganda, but is given a constitutional status. So he shares power with the Kabaka, the king of Uganda. So there were five ancestral kingdoms in Uganda that were all, of course, decided and defined by the British,
Mm.
all segregated based on very ethnic and religious affiliations
Right.
to divide and conquer.
And he mentioned, I
And
think, in the book, he doesn't speak the language of the largest ethnic group in Uganda.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And so Obote is kind of viewed by the people as this like foreign British educated prop that, when independence came about, they put him to power because he would speak to the interests of the British.
Yeah.
And
So was
so
he in Britain before? Or is he like, he's not like a Nelson Mandela type figure who's in jail lobby? He's kind of like the safe choice for the Brits.
correct, he was Oxford
Yeah.
educated, so he had that connection. And so what ends up happening is there's a bit of a struggle between the Kabaka and um, President Obote. And within, 6 months or about a year, I believe, he ends up kicking out the Kabaka. So he declares a state of emergency in Uganda, allows the military to come in and forcibly remove him. And then this creates the second republic of Uganda, if you will, where there's just
Mm.
one president, and it's Obote. Um, Obote largely tries to deal with they call it the Asian question or Asian problem, by instituting some of these regulations, by saying, 51% of business ownership needs to be done by um, Ugandan nationals who he views as Black Ugandans. It didn't, and also it was kind of a big push to encourage folks to take out citizenship. So South Asians were in this unique position with after independence in 62, they could either become Ugandan nationals and revoke their British citizenship or keep British citizenship and not become a Ugandan national.
It was one or the
And
other, right? One or
it
the
was one or
other.
the other, and it was this terrible process, if I can be that honest, where in order to become a Ugandan national, you needed to show proof that you had revoked your UK nationality.
Mhm.
And in order to revoke your UK nationality, you had to have proof that you had another nationality. And of course, in this day and that point in time, it was all through mail, and it takes a long time to get your documents in order. So a lot of folks failed in trying to go navigate this process
Yeah.
because by the time you got a response from the British, they'd be like, "We need proof that you're a Ugandan," and you're like, "But I can't get this proof until you say I'm officially not a British subject."
Yeah. But a
Uh,
lot did try, right? They considered themselves Ugandan. They wanted to be citizens.
a
They were prepared
ton.
to toss the British citizenship.
There were almost 10,000 applications that were just in the queue by the time Idi Amin makes this declaration, and so there were some folks who were certainly successful. Of course, if you were born in Uganda after independence, you were automatically entitled to Ugandan citizenship, so that had
Mm.
helped. What made things more complicated from the British front is in 1964, they amended their Immigration Act. And this is because Kenyans started making the move to Britain saying, I'm a British subject. I can live here too. And this complicates situations. So they usually, I think the number was they'd usually see about 300 Kenyans per year make the move to Britain, to the UK. And of course, this is like under Edward Heath, like Prime Minister Heath, and their anti-immigration platform. Um, and what ends up happening is they see 3,000 in the first 3 months of 64. And that's following Kenyan independence. People are like, well, we have this opportunity. Let's take it. And so they create a new Immigration Act that says you must have a parent or grandparent that's a naturalized British citizen
Mhm.
in order to be eligible to become a UK national.
Mhm.
So what that means is it would mean my parents or my grandparents needed to have formal UK citizenship, needed to actually live in the UK
Mm.
in order for
Mhm.
me to get that pathway.
Which is
If
effectively nobody at that point.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so this creates that problem of so many stateless people, quote
Yeah, and that's really, I think for me as an immigration lawyer, that's a really important point that I've thought about a lot and looked at my family history because in my dad's family, he was one of the ones who was he gave up his British citizenship. I haven't seen all the paperwork, but this is what I'm told. he did have Ugandan citizenship, he thought, and he had siblings who kept their British protectorate status and did not take out Ugandan. And guess where the siblings that kept their British status ended up? In the UK, whereas he was very last minute still in Uganda, wanting to stay in Uganda. But
Did
then
they leave before him?
largely yes. And I think that's it's a result of a few variables, probably one that he didn't want to leave, and two, maybe sorting out where he would go. Obviously ended up in Canada in the end, but I saw that. I've heard about this now within families, some kept, and I mean, they were grown by that time. Like my dad was 29 when he came to Canada. So he and his siblings were all in their sort of 20s and 30s, but some of them took out the Ugandan, some of them didn't. So it's interesting within families how that made a difference on where they ended up.
Yeah. Well, I would assume also during the time of Obote, at least, nobody was anticipating that a few years later a new leader would come in who would give everyone 90 days to leave. So let's get into the Idi Amin. So how does he wind up replacing Obote?
Yeah, so in 1971, Obote is away in Singapore at a Commonwealth conference, and Idi Amin is his lead military general at this point. So he's kind of got control of the army, and he was really a man of the people. Very populist, could speak the local languages. Was even after he'd come to power, it was very common for him to show up to like football, like soccer matches, in his Land Rover, like wave to the crowd. And things like that. So he had a lot of favor amongst the people. And so he saw this as an opportunity that while Obote's out of the country, we could do a formal and bloodless coup. We could just take over the country and then he would be stuck. He wouldn't even be able to return to the country because I would declare myself as president and military general of Uganda. And so that's what ends up happening in I think it's in late 1972 is when he comes to power. And he even meets with the South Asian community late in 1971 to start pushing them about the dominance that they present in the community. So he starts talking about things like, you know, you're only 1% of the population and you control almost 90% of trade. You control 80% of the commercial sector. And so when we thought we had ousted the British, they were just replaced by these brown colonialists. We're still being exploited by this same structure. And so how do we transfer these to the hands of, he would call them my black brothers and sisters, referring to black Ugandan, uh,
Yeah.
the black Ugandan population, because he did not view South Asians, regardless of how long they had been in the country. Some had been in there 4, 5, even 6 generations. Some people have these very deep historical roots to Uganda, had participated in movements towards independence, and were quite vocal about it. Uh, and trying to really demonstrate their attachments to Uganda and their Ugandan and African identities. But that being said, he had started asking questions about, a lot of folks are taking wealth outside of the country. A lot of people are being Ugandan educated or using these opportunities to go study in the UK and then coming back to work. And again, not really establishing these firm roots or contributing socially. So in terms of that social integration, this is one of the big legacies of the colonial empire, where it was embedded in society everywhere. Where if you went to a local government office, for example, there were 3 separate bathrooms, one for the whites,
Mm.
one for the browns, one for the blacks. There were 3 separate blood donation clinics. One, like the Red Cross had 3 different blood banks. It was rampant in society to keep folks separate. And then within the South Asian community, they took this a step further and even they had this thing called the pentangular games. And one of my oral history participants talks about this really well to say, we had cricket teams that were like all going, all Muslim, all Sikh, all Hindu, and then sometimes even smaller subcommunities, like a largely Ismaili Muslim team, or a largely like South Goan team. So things got really specific really fast and
Yeah.
made things very difficult. So Idi Amin was asking tough questions like, what about intermarriage? What's going on here? There's He starts asking these tough questions and he's like, prove to me that you actually have this long-term vested interest in Uganda. And so a lot of the community comes back in this conversation to say, a lot of these allegations are unfair. A lot of us are doing this philanthropy. And what we choose to do with our wealth is kind of our own decision. It was not a moment where the leaders of the South Asian community that were at this table were coming back to say, you know, let's work together on this integration piece. Let's work together on establishing these long-term roots and showing you where we want to go. So there are some academics that talk about how some of this is potentially of the own South Asian communities doing. Their failure to integrate, their failure to participate in all levels of society, some of their own prejudice towards the Black community was coming out. And it was, yeah, some folks do make that argument to say that failure right there is what prompted all of this. Had there been more examples of good faith, it'd be very different. And I think that came out in a lot of the oral histories. One person in particular talks about how when they had come to Canada, they had worked a 12-hour shift at a garage and were only paid for 6 hours. And he said, when I came home that day and I complained about this to my brother, I said, and this is exactly what we were doing to our staff back in Uganda. And so he's like, it took me all the way getting kicked out of my own country and coming to Canada to realize the level of exploitation that we were doing. And I like the way he phrases it. He says, and everybody is denying it now that we're in Canada. We weren't prejudiced in Uganda at all. And he's saying, I mean, it was very obvious.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned intermarriage. I think in the book, I can't remember if you said that Idi Amin pointed out that there were 6 instances of intermarriage between Asian and Black.
Yeah. And so there's like, of course, it's like shady data in
Yeah.
terms of where he's getting this from and the numbers, but the numbers are certainly very small. There are very few people, even in the oral histories, when I was talking to folks, they were talking a lot about how it was generally frowned upon to
Yeah.
be dating someone from the Black Ugandan community. They were
Well,
like, it's just something we can't do.
even within marriage, I mean, and I'm sure this is, broadly known that South Asians, like in that era, would not only marry within their race, but within their caste and within their religion. And I think that's only Shezan, maybe our generation is broken away from that, especially in Canada. But certainly, like in East Africa and in Gujaratis, there's a Lohana community, which is a caste carried over from India. And it was very much that's how you found a mate. So there was long-standing traditions behind why intermarriage wasn't. And I'm surprised to hear that there were even 6, quite frankly, supposedly. So
Well, my question when I read it was, what happened to those 6? Were they part of the
Yeah.
were they part of the decree?
Yeah. And so the really interesting thing is once the decree is announced on August 4th of 1972, a series of clauses come out after confusing the community. So about 10 days later, an announcement comes out saying, you know what, if you are actually a Ugandan citizen and you can prove it, you can stay. And then another 10 days or so go by, and they realize that they're going to lose a lot of folks in the secondary professions. They're going to lose a lot of doctors, teachers, engineers. And so they're saying, if you're part of a critical occupation that we're going to define as such, you can also stay. And then midway through September, Idi Amin comes out and says, nope, everyone's got to go. I don't even care if you have citizenship. You also have to go. So there's a small number of folks that do remain. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to too many that stayed the entire period. I know some folks that stuck a year, maybe 2 years, and then eventually left after the 90-day expulsion period, but there's a small handful of folks that did remain. There were other folks who remained, largely the elderly. So a few oral history participants were saying, we had a great grandmother who was like 80. Just the journey from Mbale to Kampala to get her paperwork done was gonna kill her. Like it's not something she could have done. So, we entrusted her to our neighbors. and we left her behind. So a lot of folks talk about the elderly, and there were a lot of people who really stayed until that 90-day expulsion period was either over or very close to being done, because they had this deep sense of attachment. A lot of
Mhm.
and a lot of novelists talk about this, and they do a really good job of
Mhm.
the analogy to say, like I was born here and I will die here. And it was really important. So I think, especially those that were older, that had spent 60, 70 years in Uganda, they had zero desire to leave
Yeah.
and start new. I can't imagine what it would be like to start, at
Well, and
70.
you talk about how initially people, when they heard the decree, were like, what the hell is this? And then as it neared, so as the deadline neared, like, was it ever made clear to people what would happen if they were still in India or in Uganda after the 90 days?
Exactly, and it's really difficult because a British reporter asked Idi Amin this very clearly, I think in August, and his answer is, "You'll see." He's like, they'll be. He uses this term, they'll be sitting on fire, to kind of say they'll be in the hot seat in a tough position, but doesn't say exactly what will happen. Um, and so he says, I can tell you that it's going to be difficult. And then rumors circulated that the plan was if there were large numbers, they would be dispersed across the country, to become what's known as like Gombola chiefs. So basically, folks that are going to be living in like tribal communities, like in rural areas of Uganda, kind of just helping out the community. Um, yeah, not
And
able to participate in the economy, like
That's a
not able to
better
own
that's a better
business.
fate than I would have imagined, because in the book you did describe there was violence leading up to the expulsion. The army was responsible for some, but it's disputed how widespread that was, I think you said.
Yeah, exactly. And so what had happened at that time is there was a specific like hit list. And so what was happening is folks affiliated with Idi Amin's regime were trying to put on pressure on the South Asian community without going so far as to launching a campaign of like actual mass violence. They did very unfortunately end up killing estimates of 300 to 500,000 Black Ugandans. And these are largely folks from the Choli and Langi tribes that were supportive of Obote's regime. So Obote had promoted a lot of those folks and put them in privileged positions. And so this was kind of Idi Amin's retribution towards that, and his military and other wings of the government were responsible for that. So what was happening was folks were trying to put on pressure, and a really good example is I can't remember if it was one of the elderly children in the Madhvani or the Mehta family, I think it was the Madhvanis, was actually imprisoned. And so
Mm.
that was kind of a
Send a
signal to the
message.
entire South Asian community to be like, whoa, if this is like the child of the grandest Asian, if you will, like the most prominent South Asian family in Uganda that can be caught and reprimanded, we should all probably leave as well. And so that was a really tough one for the community. There were instances, quite a bit of like verbal abuse. A lot of folks talked about that during these 90 days, it was a very tense environment. There were instances of violence. There had been a small number of deaths, like targeted killings, where folks were trying to again send this message. There was definitely gender and sexually based violence as well, particularly that journey to Entebbe International Airport. So it's about like a 45-minute on a good day drive from Kampala to Entebbe International Airport. And so along the way they had several checkpoints,
Mhm.
and so as folks were kind of trying to get to Kampala from different areas, you could get stopped along the way. There were some really difficult instances, also hard to uncover as an academic, because this is also something the South Asian community does not like talking about. And so people would make allusions to this, or reference it, but not really go into too much detail. And I wanted to respect that in the oral histories, but I think it was there. There was also a significant element of rumor. Some of my oral history participants kind of talked about this. That were like, if one South Asian was, molested in the streets, it was like all of us were molested in the street, because the community was very, very tight knit. And so these stories would go out. From the research, we definitely saw definitely like some antagonism. It was definitely present, but certainly not to the extent that actual Black Ugandans faced. Like that under Idi Amin was a very different story.
Yeah, I mean, he was brutal to. But I mean, it was obviously also serious enough that the international community was like, we gotta, help these people out. So the Brits took their own citizens, which
Correct.
Myra alluded to with, I guess, her aunts. And the Brits would not take anyone who had renounced their citizenship. So the people who had listened to Obote took Ugandan citizenship, found themselves now in an impossible situation.
Exactly. And India also took theirs. So about
Mm,
10,000 people end up going to India. So people had various citizenships, and then you have this chunk of people that are officially stateless. So they were Ugandan nationals, and their documents are either not recognized or very simply just taken away.
yeah. Well,
So
you
I'll use
mentioned one guy became stateless because the Ugandan officer threw his passport in the garbage, and it's like,
and
now you're stateless.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was very arbitrary, and folks were kind of just confiscating passports. Like, one person even had their passport set on fire in front of them at a checkpoint. So, folks were in a difficult situation. My family as well. So, like my mom's documents were considered invalid. They would say, you obtained this document fraudulently. There are really interesting instances. There's one oral history participant who talks about how when he went to get his passport verified, it just so happened that one of his high school classmates was the person verifying applications. So when he went to go see the person he was supposed to see, they said, "This is garbage." He turned to his friend and he said, "Hey, I didn't know you were working here." And he's like, "Yes." And he's like, "Give me your documents," and said, stamp, this is verified. He's a Ugandan citizen. And he was actually working for the Ugandan government. He was a civil servant. He was of
So
Goan
did he get
background.
to stay if
So
by stroke of the pen?
he stayed until mid 1973. And then at that point, he realized that he's like, the life we're going to live here is like, there's no future for our family here. And in a very beautiful and sad way, he explains how he wrote a letter to Uganda, the government, resigning and thanking them for the opportunity to serve his country. He said it's been an honor to serve, and it's with a heavy heart that I have to leave. Um, if I could, I would gladly stay, because he had a very strong attachment to Uganda.
Yeah. So now, oh, sorry, Mira.
I found it interesting. I think in your book and in some of the novels, they describe how you had to line up essentially to have your citizenship stripped from you to get what looks like an exit visa of some sort in order to leave, and how those lineups would go all day. You get in line at 5 in the morning, you may or may not be seen. Everybody had to go, no matter how old or young. I just thought the process, it sounded quite systematized, and maybe not organized, but sounds like immigration today sometimes actually, but it was fairly systematic.
Yes, it was, and purposefully so, of course. And
Mhm.
what ended up happening was folks needed to. They called it the Great Cattle Count, where folks had to go and show up and demonstrate that they're a Ugandan national or not. So having your citizenship verified,
Mm.
and then once it was verified, you were given sort of a red passport-ish type document, a kipande card. And so this was your Ugandan identity card to say, I have officially been verified. I can remain. And this was actually done before the expulsion decree. So this happens early 1972, where people are forced to get these documents. And so at that point, some people have their documents confiscated. And then when they show up, if they didn't participate in that whole movement, when they show up during the expulsion decree, then it's just straight, confiscation. They're just throwing them in the trash.
Oof. So Canada now. What do you want to actually just briefly explain? Because I actually don't know kind of who the Aga Khan is. I know he plays a big role in
Of course.
the resettlement, and I know that he continues to be friends with the Trudeau family. But who is he?
Yeah. So His Highness Shakrim Al Husseini the Fourth, he's the fourth Aga Khan, which was a title that was bestowed upon the Aga Khan, like the Ismaili Imamate family dating back to the Persian Empire. And so largely he's the religious head of the Shia Imami Nizari Ismaili community, which is a very small sect of Shia Islam.
Yeah.
So overall, we've got those two main branches of Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. Sunni Muslims represent about 85% of the Muslim community around the world. Shia Muslims about 15. And then there's largely four main schools of thought in the Sunni Muslim tradition. There's a couple others as well. Whereas in the Shia community, there's many different interpretations. And a lot of this just stems back to the death of the Prophet. So when Prophet Muhammad passes away, there's two there's a political and religious divide that occurs where some folks, the Shia community, believe that he had chosen his son-in-law, Ali, to be not only the political leader of this Muslim community, but also the religious leader. And so there's this declaration that he says when the Prophet says, I'm leaving behind two things, the book, the Quran, my holy book, the teachings. Of course, it was never written at that time. It was written many years later, and my family. And so Shia Muslims interpret the family line to be, oh, the family's also going to be those that help us along the way from a religious perspective. Sunni Muslims, on the other hand, say when the Prophet talks about family, he means just to be as our political leaders, not necessarily religious leaders. And so they kind of follow Abu Bakr, that is Prophet Muhammad's uncle, and his line. But what ends up happening that's really interesting in Islamic history is that they eventually all come back to Ali. So Abu Bakr comes to power, then there's two others, and then they all go, you know what, maybe we should follow Ali. In that process, there's a ton of war between the two communities and a lot of political challenges. So essentially, what's happening is people are just trying to vie for political power because this is a big new community in the Middle East, and so it leads to a lot of tension. From a Shia perspective, they then follow the line. They call it the line of Imamat. So Hazrat Ali, so Imam Ali chooses his child or well, chooses his son to be the next Imam, their son, and then all the way down. But what ends up happening is not every time, but whenever there's a choice made on the child to be the Imam, some might say, ooh, it was supposed to be another child. Or supposed to be someone else, and they follow that line for a little bit, and then it ends. Then they're kind of like, the next time the Imam returns, it's as the Messiah, and it's the end of the world. It's the Day of Judgment. So the largest Shia community is the Ithnasharis. So they kind of follow the about 12 Imams, and they're largely based in Iran. That's that large Shia community there. They follow 12 Imams, and then they say, okay, that's it. The next time the true Imam returns, it'll be the Day of Judgment. For the Ismaili community in particular, they've kind of followed child by child all the way through history until now. So the Aga Khan currently is a direct descendant of Hazrat Ali and of the Prophet as well. And so he's currently the Imam of the Shia Imami Nizari Ismaili community, known more easily as the Ismailis. And
Yeah.
so what ends up happening is in the 1960s, so in the 1900s, his grandfather was Imam at the time, and then he becomes the Imam in 1957. And so the advice during all of this independence in East Africa is become nationals in the countries in which you live. So he'd advise his community to say, there's a lot of independence happening. Same goes for India and Pakistan. Like if you live in one of these areas, become citizens. Because if that's the right, not the right thing to do, but that seems to be the logical course of action.
Does he travel? Like, where does he live during this time? Is he in?
Yeah. So he's based in Europe,
Okay.
and his headquarters at this time, I believe, should be Aigues-Mortes, so should be in France,
Okay.
not too far from Chantilly, which is pretty close to Paris. His estate has now moved to Lisbon, but it was in France for quite some time. And so he travels a lot, travels a ton, meets with the community around the world. And his whole role is to give general political, sorry, not political, general religious advice. And he's viewed as the authority to interpret the Quran to today's context.
Mm.
So as you can imagine, the Quran's quite old. And so things have changed. And so he's viewed as that authority to provide that guidance, that spiritual guidance, based on its lineage under Prophet Muhammad.
Born in 1936 for people who are trying to figure out the exact age.
Yes, born in
Just looking up for
1936, becomes
information.
Imam in 1957 on July 11th, and is still currently the
Does he live
Imam.
in Europe because he's in exile, or is that
I
just
don't I don't think he's in exile. I think I don't know why, to be very honest. My best guess is the family had established roots there,
mm,
um, and they were granted a lease on the estate in France from the
yeah,
French government
And
for a long period of time.
he was born in Switzerland.
Yes,
So mhm.
yeah. So he's the religious head of the Ismaili faith. It's not a political leadership thing. It's like a
correct.
religious
Yeah,
head. And he goes to Uganda, as you said, says, so everybody take your local citizenship. Do you think that part of why he gets so involved after, like, do you think there's a sense of, uh-oh, what I recommended is kind of backfired?
exactly. And so that's what's supposed to happen between this. There's an alleged phone call that happens almost right after the expulsion decree between Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the Aga Khan. And in this phone call, he asks, is it possible for Ismailis to secure safe haven in Canada? Because I have given them this advice.
Mm.
And if all of them followed my advice, we're going to be in a bit of trouble.
That's a
And
huge thing to have on your shoulders. Like,
exactly.
yeah,
And so the community is, of course, like looking for support and guidance. And there are a lot of folks, this is what also becomes very interesting, that did not take the Aga Khan's advice and remained British nationals. And so a lot of folks were actually okay and able to go to the UK. And that led to a bit of confusion from our Canadian immigration officials in Kampala because they were saying, we were told if you're a Smiley, you're stateless. If you're stateless, you're a Smiley. And
yeah,
they're like, people are walking in here saying, I'm a Smiley, like, take me to Canada. And they're like, but this is your British passport. Like, sorry, you need to go elsewhere.
yeah.
um, that was super fascinating to see that come out from a very like unbiased perspective. Like these were just immigration officials saying, this is what we saw on the ground.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, their views, I think you stress in your book, there was a deep political background of what was going on in terms of the level of support for immigration in both the UK and in Canada at that time. The officials, the way you describe, are actually very warm and welcoming, I want to say, towards potential immigrants. And I think that's a really great part of your book. I really enjoyed reading that. But what some of the policies were kind of shifting based on what and it was leading up to an election as well in Canada, which is
it
really
can
an interesting point. But
exactly. So the Aga Khan asked for assistance, and of course, we have no evidence of what happened in this phone call or what transpired, but that's kind of what comes out of it. And then we see that once Trudeau makes the announcement, there's a meeting that happens with the Aga Khan, this same like famous hockey meeting late September. And in those meeting minutes, they say very clearly, which is super fascinating, is to say, okay, so the Aga Khan says these folks like Smileys, if they're stateless, they're refugees. They're not stateless. They are refugees, except because the definition says you need to be outside
Mm.
your country of origin. He says they are de facto refugees. Like they just need to leave Uganda and they're refugees. So what can we do for this population? And so the Canadian government officials there say, we understand that they're in a very precarious situation. However, our immigration criteria has to remain universal. It has to be a universal policy that does not privilege one community over the other. But given the plight that they're facing, let's zero in on those who are stateless, because frankly, that's who we should target. So if you cannot go to the UK, if you cannot go to India, you are truly, a refugee, although you're still in Uganda, in your country of origin, we should preference those. And so the really interesting thing is because of that policy decision, almost 1,000 Goans come to Canada because they had all become Ugandan nationals to serve in the government, to serve in the Ugandan civil service. So sometimes they often joke that they're also thankful for the Aga Khan because they got a whole bunch of them out because of
Yeah.
this policy. So
Well, I
he
would
was
imagine that
advocating.
for the average guy, like Western white, I assume white officer who goes to Uganda, they wouldn't know the distinction between Goan, Ismaili, Gujarati, Sikh.
It would be hard to tell. I think Sikhs is a little bit different because they do have like religious garb, and so it's like a little bit easier because they have identifiers. But um, Goans and Ismail like South like hard, very hard to tell if you're just looking at someone on the surface. It'd be
Yeah.
difficult. You could go by like names, so like Goans have that Portuguese influence. A lot of people have like English/Portuguese, like definitely Portuguese last names, and then more like Anglophone type first names. That makes it a little bit easier. But
Yeah.
even then, like I don't know if, at least from the evidence in the archives, it did not seem like officers were given that. Well, they were given they were equipped with some level of knowledge to be like these are the communities that you're going to be dealing with. But again, they were told it doesn't really matter what their religious background is. We're really trying to focus on those that are stateless.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
but
I was
Canada does still admit a bunch of British nationals. So almost 2,000 British passport holders end up coming to Canada because that policy shift happened later. So
Mm.
boots on the ground, they open up shop September 4th in Kampala, but that change in policy doesn't happen until very late September, early October. And at this point, they had received all the applications and they had already started interviewing folks. And that's one thing that Michael says that's really interesting is he says, because we had such a massive intake, and weren't and didn't have the luxury or time to start getting back to folks to say, you're not eligible, you're inadmissible. We were just going through the interviews. We got a lot of, he argues, very truthful information. Because if
Mhm.
we were saying we're just looking for stateless, he's like, there's a high chance people might have not told us
Yeah.
exactly the
So
truth so
going
that they
back
could
to
get to Canada.
what were the criteria being? Because you spent considerable time in the book talking about this, and like I was saying, selection in the point system is goes back so far, and it's really interesting the way it was deployed here. Can you talk a little bit more about that in detail?
Yeah. So at that time, there was no formal refugee policy. So Canada did sign the UN Convention and Protocol on Refugees in 1969. So they were recent signatories on the new version because they found that the original version didn't go so far. It was really just looking at European displaced persons.
Mm.
And they're like, this needs to be global. So they signed in 69, but don't have formal refugee policy in the Immigration Act, which does not allow officers tools that they need to be flexible. What they do have is what's called the Oppressed Minorities Clause. And this means if you're in your country of origin facing persecution or facing a situation where you're a minority that is being disenfranchised, this gives us a little bit of room in immigration policy and within the point system to admit you to Canada. It doesn't give you full blown flexibility as if you were a refugee, but it gives you a little bit more. So a lot of officers at that time, and this has changed, but at that time, they had almost 10 points that they could allocate just on officers' discretion.
Mhm.
Um, and so
Mhm.
that's what Michael Malloy talks about this. I haven't spoken to a lot of other immigration officials from that time period or even after, but he says that was one of the pieces in the system that was incredible for officers. So he's like, because we have that flexibility, when you're speaking to someone, you can see, their desire, you can see what's actually happening. They may not have the credentials, they may not have what we're looking for, but we can give that points. We can give the 10
Yeah.
points. We can get them to that threshold, or we can get them very, very close. We can get them to like 45. And then we can go to our senior immigration official and say, you know, we really think this is they're young, entrepreneurial, they're going to do just fine in Canada. It's worth taking the
My
risk.
understanding was, and maybe I'm inaccurate, but the vast majority were educated, very strong English skills, um, work experience. Women were encouraged to work. Maybe that was later in the when they got to Canada, but I thought it was really interesting the way in the Ismaili community, women were encouraged to work. And this is in the 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe.
Yeah. And so, okay, I'll start with that Ismaili piece. The
Mhm.
really interesting thing is not even this Aga Khan, his grandfather, the previous Imam, had
Mhm.
given guidance in the late 1800s, early 1900s, saying if you only have funding to educate one of your children, and it's a boy or a girl, educate the girl.
Hmm.
So it was a very progressive view at the time, as
Interesting.
you can imagine. And
Mhm.
so this is one of the things, and it just so happens that those that came to Canada under this movement that were women, they were getting employed almost immediately. There was a huge demand for clerical staff, and that also creates all kinds of interesting social dynamics when you're now a female breadwinner of a house in a brand new country and you're the one kind of dishing out the cash to the family. I look at my mom's experience as super fascinating because it was her two younger brothers, and my grandma. And so my mom would give her mom an allowance, which was really funny as well. But
Wasn't your mom 19 when she came? Is
she
that
was
first
19,
page of your
exactly.
book? Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
and this is where these immigration officers play this very, very fascinating role because during the interview, it was my grandma that applied as head of the family, principal applicant, and she's coming with 3 dependents. And the immigration officer is doing this interview, and my mom is translating the entire thing. So grandma's speaking Gujarati to my mom's translating to English to the officer, English, back and forth. And during this process, the immigration officer explains that the principal applicant, my grandmother, has no skills, has no formal education, cannot speak the language, and is going to be a dependent on the Canadian system, and then is bringing 3 more dependents. But he says, however, if my mom is the principal applicant and is the head of the family, she's easily going to get employed. She has incredible English and has she had done a 1 year degree in like stenography and beauty school. So she was easily going to be employed. And they said, if you're the principal applicant and you come with 3 dependents, no problem, because you're going to look after them. Challenge is my mom is actually 17 at the time.
Right.
So the immigration officer says, give me your passport. And he comes out and he just puts a piece of whiteout over her birth year, changes the year, and stamps it and says, welcome to Canada. Unheard of today, like not possible, sadly.
How is
But
that for procedural fairness, Steve? Would you say?
I think that probably happens more than we think. But not like putting a piece of tape over,
No,
but
but the
office like
officer did it. The officer did it, right? Like that's what's
yeah,
really
I mean
I
altering
found
documents,
really
no, but
interesting.
officers exercising discretion one way or the
Mhm,
other, yeah.
mhm.
I'd like to think anyways. Like it's funny, like it's those types of stories that do actually give me faith in the system a bit, because and I do think that that probably goes on more than we think, where well, what does some visa officers say? It's easier to approve, especially if someone's in front of you, than to refuse.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Um,
So
but
here, I'm not too
the
sure if I answered all of your question. Yeah.
No, I think you really did. Yeah, thank you.
and what so also you talk about in your book about how so what were they able to leave with, the Ugandans?
Mm.
So they were able to leave with very little. They could leave with about the equivalent of like $140 Canadian. Um, Often on their way to the airport, they were like robbed and looted at these various checkpoints. It happened all the way. So at various checkpoints, they'd go through your luggage. You were allowed to take 2 pieces of luggage and some cash, about 143 Canadian dollars, with you. By the time you actually got onto the plane, you had lost some of your luggage.
Yeah.
So if people were trying to like hide jewelry or things like that, and most of your cash. So folks were very lucky if they were able to take anything out of the country. There were a small minority who had these like offshore bank accounts. This was another one of the big allegations of Idi Amin is like you got all this money outside. That's why we need to be so harsh. There were also some folks who were buying at the time these world class around the world tickets
Yeah.
that they would then refund once they got to Canada or the UK or elsewhere. And Idi Amin was very quick to put a stop to that as well. And even actually targeted a Ugandan Asian who was a travel agent that was facilitating some of these.
You put that
And so
person in
they,
jail, right? You put the person.
yeah. And so
Mhm.
they were very fortunate to get out of the country overnight, thankfully. But that created a bit of a situation as well. So folks weren't able to take anything out of the country. Some there's I haven't been able to confirm this, but there are I think it's Yasmin Ali Brown's book talks about how um in her like novel that's also a cookbook at the same time, a really interesting read. She talks about how on the plane to the UK, there's 2 folks sitting beside each other, and she turns to this auntie, and the auntie's like, "Oh, would you like some like budget, which are like deep fried like potato and onion Indian snacks?" And she opens it, and the girl's about to grab one, and she goes, "No, no, no, you need to be careful." And so she sticks her finger inside this dough and starts ripping it open, and there's a gold bangle inside. And so she had deep fried her jewelry, so that she could take it out of the country
That's a
because
very big budget to fit a bangle. I read that part and I was picturing lots of small ones in a
it's
Tupperware, which is still common today, but to have
day
a ring in each one,
one.
that's
Yeah,
quite ingenious.
it was exactly. It's quite ingenious. Some people were trying to like have like different layers of their luggage and kind of like stitch it in. Someone I just met the other day was telling me about how they stitched. They had a Canadian teacher in Uganda who had given them a $20 Canadian bill, and she stitched it into her blanket, and took the blanket to on the plane ride.
Yeah. You also mentioned, I think, that the Canadian government paid for flights because they didn't, Idi Amin was trying to profit off of the tickets, which was, yeah.
Exactly. So fascinating. Idi Amin says, you got to use East African Airways, one, and two, since you're going to be charging folks using your assisted passage loans, I want a 50% cut of that. And so he was trying to strong arm the
Yeah.
Canadians to say, unless you're going to offer this for free, I'm going to profit off of it. And Trudeau Sr. says, we're going to offer it for free.
Hmm. So this is the first and the, well, maybe not, well, I think it is possibly both the first and the largest refugee resettlement into Canada, coming off like up until World War II, where there was no non-white immigration, basically no non-British immigration to Canada. Um, what what was the reception?
Yeah, so the really interesting thing about the reception is that overall it was quite good. Um, the federal government played a pretty strong role in ensuring that folks were integrated well. But also, we have to remember some of the nuances of this community. So this community, even to this day, is still viewed as like the the most well resettled refugee community, the creme de la creme. But we also have to remember the reason they were being kicked out is because they were the top 1% of the population,
Mhm.
very highly educated, very entrepreneurial. All of them had like the vast majority had English language skills. So even when you run the metrics on the admittance, like average years of schooling was 14 per applicant. Like for a refugee population, this is incredible. So folks did really well once they got to Canada, but that's the myth that we have to challenge. We have to challenge about what was the reality on the ground. So did they experience discrimination? Absolutely. There was this whole idea of packy baiting that became really, really rampant in the late 70s, early 80s, where it was this big pushback against anyone that looked South Asian. Where they would say, "Oh, you bloody packy," or things like this, and try to antagonize any brown body to be affiliated with this. And so it was definitely a pejorative term that was used to hurt folks.
It's called
Um,
packy baiting?
Packy baiting, yeah, was the term they
Yeah.
used. And it got so bad in places like Vancouver that police started increasing patrols in the downtown core to eliminate some of these issues. Or there
And
was
is this a backlash to the is Miley like Ugandan resettlement or something
this is
else?
sort of a backlash against all
Mm.
immigration. And a lot of this is because, with we have official deracialization of immigration policy in 1968, and then this gets formalized in the 76 Immigration Act. So people are kind of really feeling this threat of, there is no more white Canada. And then especially when you have that larger movement, right? So we start seeing the top source countries change in the 70s and especially into the 80s. And then you have the Indo-Chinese, right? So Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotians,
Mhm.
60,000 come between 79 and 81. So the makeup of Canada is starting to change, especially if you're in a metropolitan city. Like it's happening. And so there was even an instance, I think in Toronto, where someone was shot and killed. And it was like a white Canadian who was dating like a South Asian boy.
Yeah.
And so that instance kind of course, sent shockwaves throughout the community. But this is the level of antagonism folks were facing. And then the most common ones that I'm sure both of you are incredibly familiar with is they were all asked for Canadian experience, and Canadian credentials, when they got there. So a lot of folks were like, I'm like a UK educated trained teacher, but I cannot be a teacher here in Canada. This is weird. Or I am a
Mhm.
British educated lawyer and I
Yeah.
worked in Uganda for 10 years and you're telling me this is not valid?
So a couple of things, like first thing on the licensure, like so with my own dad, he was a family doctor for probably 5 years in Uganda and then 40 years upon arrival here. And he had studied abroad in his 20s in both the UK and the US, and then went back to Uganda. Like I told you, he was very committed to practicing jungle medicine, is what I was told my whole childhood. And he was able to get licensed relatively quickly in Canada. So maybe that's a function of the, doctor shortage, which continues to this day.
Or which province? Wouldn't that be
Good
which
question,
province did your
Steve.
dad move
It
to?
was Alberta and Saskatchewan only, is what I've been told. And so he spent the first years at a very small hospital in Ponoka, anyone who's from Alberta will know that's actually a mental institution. Yeah. So he was there, and then he ended up in Saskatchewan for a really long time. And funnily enough, went back to Ponoka for a couple of years in the 90s before ending up in Calgary.
Was he resettled there? Or did he pick where he moved to?
No, so I'm glad you're asking these because they're really interesting, because I've gone back and asked my mom some of these things to refresh my memory. So he came to Montreal. I think it was one of the last flights. And then he only stayed in Montreal. I think that was just, you described that in your book, Shezan, right? Like just very briefly. And he'd only ever heard of Vancouver. So he made his way to Vancouver. He stayed at the YWCA for a week or two, which I understand the Y was very involved in the resettlement, which is really interesting. Leads into my second point, which was very generous, very robust resettlement attitudes for those first few years. But going back to my dad, so he then left Vancouver after a few weeks and ended up in Ponoka. And I think at first he was given something less than a full physician, job, but managed to get his license fairly quickly within a year or two. And then
So he went there for work to Ponoka?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So at the Y they facilitated a job or something, and
I don't know that. I mean, that's Shezan. Like, why don't you describe that? Because I was looking at that again just in the last few days. Like, I'm not exactly sure how my dad found that job, but I imagine it was through these efforts, through all these community support groups. So I wish I could ask him, who did you meet with that helped you line up that job?
Yeah, and there are these incredible instances where it's genuine everyday Canadians that go out of their way to find opportunities or to vouch for folks to say, this is someone I was here talking to a Goan teacher, and she was telling me about how her one of her close friends who had known someone through the Montessori school. So she was Montessori trained in Uganda, had a connection in Canada, who called the principal of a local school to say, I have a Montessori trained teacher. She should not be a teacher's assistant. She should be teaching, and advocated for her. And the principal's like, okay, bring her in for an interview. They have a conversation and given the job on the spot. So these instances where people are advocating for folks where they're able to do things, there's other universities that actually step up. I believe there was one example of Western University that had offered 6 scholarships to dentistry students, and there were folks who were already dentists and already trained, but they're like, this can be like a 6-month, 1-year recertification, and we'll foot the bill for it so that you can get into the workforce very quickly. So there were folks that were able to leverage these really small programs, often facilitated by Canadians, but it was not this like federal top-down approach. They were not getting into the weeds, again, because there's, provincial and territorial regulations around those elements. So some people were able to, other people just pure hard ingenuity. So a lot of folks were working full-time jobs and going to night school to get recertified. And so it took them 3 to 5 years to get back to at least the same level of certification here in Canada. So that was difficult. That was certainly difficult. And I imagine far more difficult for folks who were older when they arrived in Canada. So as you can imagine, when I was doing this research, a lot of my interviews happened in 2014 to 2017. It's, it had almost been 50 years at that point. So the vast majority of people I was speaking to had come to Canada between the ages of, mid-teens to 25, maybe 30. I didn't really get a chance to interview folks who were in their 90s, 80s or 90s, largely because sadly folks were passing away. There were some language issues as well. And just having the opportunity. So I think that that's a huge gap in my study, that I'll openly admit and happy to, is like, I'm so sad I did not capture those experiences. I cannot imagine what it was like to be 50, 55 coming to Canada in the 70s,
On
trying
90
to
days
navigate this.
notice?
Exactly. Or even like my grandma's experience, for example, is very different from my mom's experience. Um, a great story, I think that it's in the book, where my grandma would cut English language classes. So when she arrived, they'd all go on the bus, and my grandma was the last stop. So my mom would get off at work, go to work. My grandma was like two stops later. She would actually get off the bus and then take the bus the other way and go back home.
And she
Uh,
was in her 40s when they came?
she was in her 40s, yeah.
Interesting.
She had no desire to be in Canada whatsoever. She was like, it's freezing here. No one speaks my language. No one looks like me. Why are we here? Um, yeah, she was very unhappy at the outset. And also, I mean, huge change in the power dynamic too. She's like, and now my daughter's giving me pocket money? Like, what do you mean? Um,
Mhm.
so a lot of those tough challenges, and I'd love to spend way more time having a lot more chais and conversations with family units about this, because I think the stories would just be incredible.
Were a lot of
With
families like permanently separated as a result of some going India, some going Canada, some going UK? India, especially
Yeah,
like UK, Canada, you can at least envision, okay, they're able to like travel without a visa. But if you go back to India, now it's not so easy to get a visa.
exactly. And so folks kind of went everywhere. So the challenging part is, um, and I mean, it exists in our immigration policy today, is
Mhm.
the view of a family as the nuclear family. And so, family as an example, I have two older brothers. And so while we would all want to go to Canada, we're all individual applicants. And so we would end up going wherever we can go. And so because we're not dependent on each other or dependent on my parents, we're unlikely to go to the same place. So there are family units that are spread across the world. There are some folks that are in different countries in Europe and have remained there. Um, and their family members are in Canada, in the UK, in India. Over time, folks have been able to try and get back together, but it becomes a little bit more difficult, right? After 10 years in India, and it's now 1980, are you gonna,
Mhm.
and you've established yourself, are you gonna make the effort to come to the UK or Canada, or vice versa?
That
Yeah.
leads into one of my other questions, which is what I've learned through your book and through a few others, is that some people went back to Uganda fairly quickly after Idi Amin lost power. And then in recent years, there's been another wave of migration from India into Uganda. So I wondered if you could talk about that, because that was quite interesting to me.
Yeah, exactly. So after the Civil War, so when Museveni comes to power in 1985, there's a bit of, I would say, like a cooling off period. There's a time period where Uganda's rebuilding, and then in the I think it's the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, Museveni calls for like the South Asian community to come back. And he says,
Mhm.
this was a formal wrongdoing under Idi Amin, and we welcome you to return. And this was kind of a way of helping spur economic innovation in Uganda. So kind of renewing that entrepreneurial spirit to kind of help contribute to Uganda's economy. And so, in that spirit, there are some folks that do start moving from India back to Uganda. I was very fortunate to go to Uganda last summer,
Yeah.
and the population is quite small. So the number
Okay.
of like South Asians in Uganda is definitely very small, very concentrated in the big cities, like
Yeah.
largely in Kampala. Um, you're not going to find folks in some of the smaller towns and cities. And overall, it appears to be somewhat similar. It does appear, I mean, anecdotally, that the South Asian community does kind of largely still stick to themselves. A lot of them do, of course, like know the language, like know Swahili, like are part of society, but it is still a little bit of that separation is still there. Um, a lot of folks that I've spoken to, at least from the Canadian perspective, at most they've gone back to visit. There are very few that have gone
Mhm.
back to reestablish roots. Um, some would have loved to. Some I think now were thinking about, would it have been better for us to go back? Possibly.
Is that
But
just because greater opportunity, because it's a, growing, developing economy, or?
some of it was great opportunity, and I think some of it is, and this is an assumption on my part, that as folks are now older, so in, retired, if you're retired and in Uganda, your life is pretty comfortable,
Mhm.
especially if you have like a North American income.
Yeah, yeah.
You can have house staff, you can have, all of these things taken care of you. The weather is way better, the food and things like that. So there's a lot of pros to potentially moving. But in that same token, a lot of folks say, our family is now here and established. Our grandkids are here. This is the place for us to be now. It's been 50 years. I can deal with the snow now. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Must
Uh,
also been hard for people who moved here to like read what was going on. I mean, yeah, like Uganda treated them pretty poorly in the last 90 days, but like that country spirals into a civil war. I think Amin kills up to 500,000 people in just persecutions. Like that must have severed further ties, I would think, that they held, like
exactly.
emotional or psychological ties that they held. Like the place totally is collapsing.
And there are still folks that feel a sense of betrayal. They feel that Uganda betrayed them through this expulsion decree. Um, and those are largely folks that had those deep, deep ties to
Mhm,
Uganda, that had been there for generations,
mhm,
that had really participated in political movements, because they sit back and they go, for lack of a better way of putting it, like Uganda did me dirty. Like
Yeah.
they they genuinely kicked me out, and I have no desire to go back. Even
Did
though
you say
Idi
your
Amin's
dad
long
went
gone.
back and forth after?
No, no.
Oh
So
no,
my
Myra.
my
Did
dad's.
Mi
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, and I was gonna say, no, my dad absolutely never went back.
oh, okay.
And but he was very, and so he didn't talk about any of this at all. And but then towards when he got into his 60s and his 70s, he would talk about it a little bit more. But I do remember it might have been when, I don't know the time period, Shezan, maybe you can clarify, but maybe when Museveni was in power, Ugandans were invited back and were invited to reclaim their citizenship. And I remember, maybe it was in the early 2000s, and I remember him calling me and saying, "Do you think I should do this? I think I might have to give up my Canadian citizenship." And he might have had it completely garbled, but I said, "Absolutely do not give up your Canadian." I think it was like, when you get older, you start thinking about your life, you start thinking back, but he never did return back. He'd not even for a visit.
Yeah,
So,
there were opportunities to try and reclaim land, or yeah, reclaim properties, businesses, even some investments that were frozen
yeah.
at the time. It was a long process. I know folks have gone through it. Doing this research, a lot of folks reached out to me to help them navigate that process, because they're like, "You must have ties. Like,
Oh,
there
wow.
must be a way to do this. What do we do? How does it work?" Sadly, I have no insight on how that process works, but I know you did not have to actually give up your formal Canadian citizenship to access these things, but it
Okay.
was a long bureaucratic
Hmm.
process.
Hmm.
And so the standing sort of rule and some of the tension that existed was that when folks were coming back to claim properties, for example, people had moved in, because there was no formal land transfer or house transfer, any of this kind of stuff. So a lot of folks that had gone back to visit would try to find their old homes just to see them. They're like, "I want my kids or grandkids to see where I grew up." And they encountered, there was actually a bit of animosity when they were knocking on doors, because folks were like, "Oh crap, you're here to take my livelihood away." And they're like, "No, we're genuinely just here for a visit." And a lot of folks talk about how difficult it was going back, largely because, you crystallize those memories as a kid about your house being so big with this beautiful mango tree and all those kinds of things, and you go back and it's not kept the same way, or it's much much smaller than you remember because you're now an adult. And so they talk about how difficult it was seeing that. So some folks told me they don't want to go back to Uganda because they want to leave the good memories as good memories.
Hmm.
um, Others talk about how difficult it was to go back and see the state of their homes because they weren't kept up, because no one had the legal obligation to keep it up. So they were like, these homes are in pretty rough shape, and someone else is living there. Like, it's not what we left, and obviously it's not what you left. It makes
Yeah,
sense,
yeah.
but
And it would be hard seeing someone, I guess. And I could understand where that person's like, uh-oh, are you claiming your
yeah,
your house back.
My other question was,
This has been really fascinating.
can I ask one more? Can you compare the resettlement effort with, subsequent, because we've had so many now over the last 50 years. Did this help inform some of those? And are there any comparables?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll credit Mike to all of this for his vision. So Michael Mollay was really talking about how they learned some really important lessons early on with the Uganda movement that they started to implement in the 76 Act, in particular with the Indo-Chinese resettlement. And so the first is they were talking about how when folks were submitting applications in Kampala, if they had an auntie and uncle, a relative in Canada already, sending a message saying, so and so is my nephew, here's their application number, get them to Canada, I'll look after them. Immigration officers pretty much looked at this as, well, that's 50 points right there. Like this is someone that's going to do well because they have that support. Yes, they'll still be entitled to government support once they get here and all of those good things and the integration efforts, but having that relative, having that family member is going to be a big bonus. And so Mike talks about how this really spurred the idea and how folks integrated under this Ugandan Asian movement in Canada, the idea of private sponsorship. It's the idea of folks coming together to bring families to Canada because this was very different. And so for the most part, a lot of the like longitudinal studies that look at PSR, so privately sponsored refugees, versus GARs, government assisted refugees, PSRs tend to do better. So they tend to do better across all metrics of socioeconomic outcomes and things like that. There is a very important nuance. One of them is that GARs typically tend to be more vulnerable, which typically means they have higher needs. So you're going to have larger populations of folks that are facing certain disabilities or mental health challenges and things like that. So you're going to have more single-headed households with many children or things like that. So it is a tough nuance, but what a lot of the studies point out is that while government assisted refugees receive aid for a year and then it ends, you usually transition into your provincial or territorial system at that point if you're still in need to get you back up on your feet. With PSRs, because the families or the group of five or community group, or often many churches, mosques, various religious organizations, temples, you name it, they all actually are sponsorship agreement holders. They bring families in as well. They're on the hook for 1 year, but they often don't stop. So you can imagine if, a group of five of us brought together a family or even just like two or three folks together, after a year, we're very unlikely to kick them to the curb. We're there to say, how can we help you further your career? We're often willing to go above and beyond and use our networks. Because we technically only have one case, we have one family to look after. Where our service provider organizations have multiple families under each caseworker. It's difficult. They do their best, and they're doing some incredible work. And that's one of the things we're seeing as the difference between PSRs and GARs. And so Mike Malloy talks about how this really influenced that movement in the Indo-Chinese resettlement. And one of the really beautiful things that I think gets lost in our Canadian history is every time the Canadian public has stepped up and challenged the government to do a resettlement initiative. And so what happens is in the Indo-Chinese example, they say, for every family we bring, you bring, 1-to-1. They had to shut down the program because Canadians stepped up.
Syrians.
So exactly, same with the Syrians. So out of the 60,000, 40,000 were privately sponsored. 40,000. And so Canada is actually the only country in the world that has been awarded the Nansen Medal from the UN, HCR, is the only country that's been awarded this as a country for their refugee resettlement efforts. So usually the award is given to an organization or one individual to say, for all of your efforts, we want to recognize you globally as this champion of refugee rights. I can't remember the exact year that Canada was awarded the Nansen Medal, but this was a medal offered to the entire Canadian public. And so this is why we have this incredible history and legacy of, refugee resettlement in Canada, is because we saw it with the Indo-Chinese, we saw it with the Syrian movement, and I'm sure if there was another opportunity, it would happen again, where when it's open to the Canadian public, when it's open to people, and I think that's the most beautiful thing, when it's like human to human, these shared human connections, Nothing can really
Another
stop us.
analogy
Yeah.
would be like they're very careful to not call it refugee resettlement, but the Gaza program has this similar idea of an anchor. And they're very careful to say, oh no, it's just a visitor visa program, but like whatever, it's gonna it will they aren't I can't envision. I think everyone must assume they aren't going back. And it's the same idea. Like it's not a privately sponsored refugee, but there's an anchor on the visitor visa. Same with the Sudanese program that they brought in.
Yeah, and so I think that stems from this ideology of, if you have ties to Canada, you often fare better.
Hmm.
And that is one of the things that will bump up your immigration application as well, if you do have a relative living in Canada as well.
To this day, under express entry.
And so you're still taking new stories. If people are listening, they should, look you up, contact you, share their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just do the selfish plug. It's like
Yeah.
Shezan dot Muhammedi at cunet.carleton.ca. Or you can just check out the Uganda collection and send your inquiry there. More than happy to get folks involved. It's still incredible. I am so thankful to the community who've, invited me to their homes and offered these incredible stories of their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I think you had a good point when you, kind of to paraphrase, like when stories aren't told, they're forgotten. So like collecting this is, super important.
Yeah, like when my mom told me that first story of that immigration officer, or when she would got to the bank, and her coworkers had all gotten together and gotten something for her, and she says, I was in this country for 3 days and I already felt Canadian. I was like, that's it. Like, this is nowhere. Like, nowhere in our history books, nowhere is this taught. And I was like, this is, if we're going to call ourselves a multicultural country, we need to capture these multicultural histories. And they're beautiful. Like I, I don't know. I always struggle to put it into words, but the power of seeing yourself in Canadian history or in any
Hmm.
history, it just speaks volumes. It gives you so much this grounding that when, someone comes on the street uninformed and says, Shezan, go back to India, go back to where you came from, I can proudly kind of say, yeah, I'll go back to Orleans on Ontario in Ottawa. That's where I'm from. And here's proof. Like here's like documented evidence of how the Canadian government facilitated the movement of my parents and our establishment here in Canada. And we've got a long legacy of this. And there's so many communities that have amazing stories to tell as well. And I think the more we can bring this to the forefront, the better.
Absolutely. And I think we started our conversation today by my expressing my gratitude for you to do this research and to publish this book, because I started looking in about 2005, 2006 for the trajectory to find, and I'm not a historian like you, but to find how did the Indians get to East Africa, and then what happened, and the details on not just Uganda, but my mom is from Burundi and then in Tanzania. So maybe someone will take up the charge and start writing about those countries, and maybe they have. But just immense gratitude for you to you for publishing this and educating so many of us. I think we're on, like, and as Steve said, I'm sending the book around to my family because I think everyone should read it.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind. I'm touched. It's an honor. It's like such a privilege to get to tell these stories.